So welcome everybody. Welcome to the first seminar of the series for this term. And to start us off, I'm really delighted that we have Professor Pia Schober here. Pia is Professor of Sociology at the University of Tübingen, and she's also a research fellow of the German Institute for Economic Research, the DEW of Berlin. She's held various postdoctoral positions, and she started off, she did her PhD here at the LSE, so she's come back to the LSE. So for all PhD students here, this is what you could become if you put your mind sufficiently to it. So Pia's research interests comprise gender and social inequalities in employment, childcare and child development, as well as analysing the impacts of family policy and early childhood education policy. Today she's going to be talking about gender ideologies. She's going to be talking about family structure and the gender ideologies of youth. And she's going to be talking for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for you to ask questions after that. I'm sure you will have many. And you can ask questions either by raising your hand or by indicating in the chat that you want to ask a question, and then I'll ask you to say it. So great. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Pia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Of course, I'm very happy to be back, even if only virtually, at the LSE. And I'll try and share my screen now. So this presentation is a part of a larger project funded by the German Research Foundation. And the project is generally looking at gender socialization, influences of parents and peers across different contexts, different countries, different ethnicities. And in this paper here, we are focusing on different family structures. And it's joint work with Ludovica Gambo, who is also here, and who also graduated and did her PhD at the LSE in social policy. So we are both, I think, very, very happy to present our work here. And also another PhD student at University of Tübingen, Marie-Fleur Philipp, is also working on this paper. So our starting point really is that, as we all know, there is increasing plurality of family forms with dependent children in many Western countries. So here I've shown some numbers for Germany, but in the UK it's very similar. And slightly higher percentages of children who actually at any one point do not live with two biological parents. And we also know that the trends towards greater egalitarianism generally has slowed down in most Western countries. And of course, that depends on the dimension you look at, to what extent it has halted or just slowed down. But anyway, that seems to be relatively well established also for the UK. And there is this literature on intergenerational change in gender ideologies, how transmission works, which really mostly exclusively focuses on biological two-parent families. So we want to kind of connect this literature with the general assumption in many US studies that single parents hold less traditional gender ideologies, which they transmit to their children, and then they also serve as non-traditional role models by being more likely to combine employment and care. And we, to some extent, question this general assumption and argue that it's likely to depend on the welfare state context and the kind of incentives the context sets due to indirect effects on the work-care arrangement of single parents. And therefore, we think the UK context is a very interesting one because it varies in the kinds of social policy provision made for single parents. We focus specifically on adolescents here and their gender ideologies, because this is an interesting phase as children acquire more sophisticated reasoning skills and are getting exposed to more diverse ways of doing gender in societies, apart from their own family background. And we know from other studies that there is substantial change in values during adolescence. So generally, studies have found there is a change towards greater openness in values, and this partly on one of our recent studies, we also find the same for egalitarianism. So adolescents tend to become more egalitarian over time, and the amount of change seems to be greater than what we generally see during adulthood. And towards the end of adolescence, then in early adulthood, these sort of gender beliefs have also been found to be predictive of educational choices and later employment and family transitions. So it's worth kind of knowing how these gender ideologies and beliefs are formed. And overall now, we think this focus on adolescence is particularly worth looking at with respect to other family forms, because so far really the focus has been on intact couple families. Our conceptual framework is generally based on social learning theory and approaches assuming influences through exposure. And as logically, I mean, the family provides one very important environment that exposes children to beliefs and practices in terms of gender. And the mechanisms of socialization suggested by social learning theory are mainly through interactions, so through instruction, talking about gender ideologies, norms in the society children live in, but also through rewarding or sanctioning gender non-conforming, so rewarding gender conforming behaviors and sanctioning non-conforming behaviors. And that way parents pass their gender ideologies on. In addition, it has been stressed that role modeling is a very important mechanism that allows a more direct transmission, for instance, through maternal employment or the division of domestic work in the parental household. One important aspect that has been stressed in more recent perspectives on socialization is that children are quite active agents. So they have some influence on choosing activities, choosing environments, and how strongly they are influenced by them. And one aspect to keep in mind in our study here is that self-interest varies probably between boys and girls, as girls tend to benefit more from more egalitarian ideologies of their own, as well as in society as a whole. Looking at the empirical evidence on variations across in gender ideologies across family forms so far, actually we can summarize that very briefly because there is very little evidence so far. And it's all based on US data to our knowledge, and generally points to gender beliefs of single mother families and their children being less traditional than of the parents of mothers in two-parent families and their children. When we then look at the transmission processes, so the influence of parental gender ideologies and maternal employment across family forms, here we have even fewer studies to go on. I mean, here the most important or directly relevant study is by Causal and Knöster from 2011, again based on relatively old US data from the late 80s and early 90s, when they find that young adults who lived with a single parent at any point in time held less traditional gender ideologies than those who lived with married parents throughout their childhood. And they find that the transmission of the gender ideologies from the mothers did not vary across family forms, and they did find a significant correlation of these gender ideologies between mothers and children. And they are not able to focus on or say anything about biological fathers, but focus on stepfathers. And here they find that stepfathers only transmit their gender ideologies to children if they have a relatively high quality relationship with them. And there is just one more study that really looked at the correlation of having a working mother with egalitarian and found that that is associated with the egalitarian attitude of adolescents across all family forms. So this provides some evidence that is relevant to the study, but still there is a lot more to improve our understanding of what is happening in terms of transmission processes across family forms. So our contribution, what we are trying to do in this paper, is first describe the variation in gender ideologies of adolescents that live in different family forms in the UK context, then explore the strength of transmission of gender ideologies of both the biological mother and the biological father, and also explore the influence of role modeling through maternal employment across these family forms. And then thirdly, we try to provide the first longitudinal evidence on whether there is actually something like a causal effect of children experiencing their parents' breakup between age 11 and 14, and then becoming less traditional in their gender ideologies over that time period. Whether we can actually see that, which has often been implicitly or explicitly assumed by American studies for both parents and children, that this sort of gender ideology change would happen through breakup experiences, but never explicitly tested. So first, I'll probably, and many of you know better than me, but I'll try and say a little bit about the UK context in terms of welfare policies supporting self-determination, which is understood as the capacity to form and maintain an autonomous household, which we think are the most relevant policies to single parents. For our question here, and on the whole, we would assess these as the UK policies providing relatively generous social assistance benefits for single mothers compared to the US context, for instance. And even though, of course, there has been a reduction in income support benefit receipt and then an increase in job seekers allowance, so there has been a shift in policies clearly, but overall still a significant percentage of single mothers benefit from this sort of generous social assistance compared to the US context. And the upper child age threshold for claiming means-tested income support has been lowered since the 2000s, but this has occurred relatively slowly compared to other countries, like, for instance, also Germany, so for the Millennium Birth Cohort, which we will be looking at, the highest kind of child's age threshold would be 7 years, when the mother would have to start looking for work. And overall, Klassen and Clegg, for instance, have suggested that these sorts of benefits in the end result in quite high effective tax rates on return to employment, which delay the employment incentives in the UK context. And in addition, we know that childcare, so for preschool children, is largely based on market provision and resulting in relatively high costs compared to other countries. And the free entitlement is available only for a limited number of hours in England. The regulations are somewhat different in Wales and Scotland, but I think in general it's still valid to say that childcare is not easy. Finding appropriate childcare is not easy for single parents in the UK context, and therefore overall we basically concludes then, based on this policy context, that single mothers are likely to be less attached to the labour market than partnered mothers in the UK, which is quite different from the US context. Then single mothers, especially those with young children, face greater work-family conflict than mothers in two-parent families, and that might lead to potential discrepancies between their desired and their achieved employment trajectories. So it's this sort of discrepancy might lead to weaker transmission of their both ideologies as well as their actual practices on children's ideologies. That has been theoretically at least assumed by a social learning theory, that this sort of discrepancy would weaken the transmission from parents to children. And then, I mean, we do think that especially among mothers with two school-age children, parental separation might increase employment among mothers, but possibly not to the same extent as it would, for instance, in the US context. Or also in a context like Sweden, where mothers, for instance, have the right to increase from part-time to full-time hours within the same job. In a combination, then we formulate 3 hypotheses for looking at this selection and transmission processes. The first hypothesis really just kind of tests what the US literature has been assuming, that adolescents living with 2 biological parents hold more traditional gender ideologies than those living with a single or a repartnered mother. In the hypothesis 2, we then assume that the gender ideologies and the employment of the mothers are more strongly positively associated with children's gender ideologies in biological 2-parent families compared to single and repartnered mother families. So here we basically take this argument from before, that greater discrepancies between the desired and achieved employment trajectories among single mother families would then lead to weaker transmission of both gender ideologies and employment. Then the third hypothesis looks at biological fathers and the transmission of their gender ideologies. And here we would assume that their transmission or their influence is stronger among children living with 2 biological parents than in the other family forms. And it's stronger if the longer the father has been residing with the children and the more contact he had more recently with the children. Given that a lot of this transmission literature from parents to children, they basically assume that the parent of the same gender would have a stronger influence, then we might expect that this third hypothesis is expected to make a greater difference for sons than for daughters. In terms of the actual more longitudinal analysis here, where we look at the argument of role restructuring, here we formulate 2 hypotheses. On the one hand, the first is really just testing whether it is any event of that when parents break up, whether that really is associated with a change in their children's gender ideologies towards greater egalitarianism, and whether that change is greater than that experienced by other children on average, which is the general trend during that life phase. And again, we would expect that sort of effect possibly to be greater for boys, because they start from lower levels of egalitarianism in adolescents than girls, and a father absence or reduced contact with the father might impact them more strongly, because fathers also hold more traditional attitudes than mothers, so more contact with the mother and more identification with the mother might lead to greater change for them. Then hypothesis 5 kind of tries to look at this more in a more nuanced way by assuming that it's not actually parents break up per se, but it really might depend on the kind of contact and parenting arrangements that parents agree on after separation. So here then we would assume that adolescents who have more frequent contact with the non-resident father change their gender ideologies more strongly towards greater egalitarianism, because they experience their role modeling of their father being a regular caregiver for them, and their mothers maybe being more active in the labor market through also less work-family conflict, because they are not the only or the main caregiver for the children. In terms of the data, I think probably some of you were able to guess it. We're using the Millennium Cohort Study. I probably don't need to say too much about this, but it started with about 19,000 children born in 2000 and 2001 in the UK. It's a stratified sample from all the regions, and it provides relatively rich information, interviewing the parents from when the child was 9 months old, then approximately every 3 years until the child is 14 years old. And then there is a more recent sweep at age 17, but we are not using that because the children's gender ideologies have not been asked then. And we mainly focus on the sweeps, the most recent, so at age 11 and age 14 surveys, but then we of course also use information from previous sweeps. The key dependent variables we are using are to measure gender ideologies are based on 2 items. The first item is phrased, it is less important for women to work than it is for men. And that is basically capturing some aspect of gender equality in the public sphere. And then the second item focuses more on the private sphere, phrased as men and women should do the same jobs around the house. And the answers are coded on a 4-point Likert scale, and we reverse the first item so that higher values always indicate more egalitarian beliefs. Now, interestingly, the correlation between the 2 items is only moderate. So the alpha, if you were to try and combine the 2 items, is only 0.5. And therefore, we also decided not to combine them, but just to look at them separately, because they really seem to capture different aspects of gender ideologies. Here you can see the distribution of the answers at age 14. And here the key thing to note is that there is the variation isn't that great. So in the sense that most of the adolescents already hold relatively egalitarian ideologies on both items. Either they, so they always 90% basically answer in the 2 higher, more egalitarian categories, and only about 10% answer in the choose the more traditional categories. So that restricts our variation we have. So that's something to consider. And at age 11, we still have a bit more variation because children still tend to be a bit more traditional. So there's over time, there's actually quite a lot of, or quite substantial variation, with about 35% of children, 35 to 40% becoming more egalitarian, and about 15% becoming more traditional. Now, our analytical approach is using two different methods. For the first 3 hypotheses that focus on selection and transmission mechanisms, we use stepwise ordinary least squares regression models, and we account for survey sampling designs and attrition weights. And to test whether the transmission varies across family forms, we include interactions of parental gender ideologies and maternal employment with the different family structure variables we have, and the contact frequency with the father. We use separate models for boys and girls and have about 8,000 adolescents for this analysis. For the longitudinal analysis, where we test this process of role restructuring, we use fixed effects panel models and only look at the change between age 11 and age 14. And there we restrict the sample to those living with both biological parents at age 11, and then either still living in the same family form or only with their mother at age 14. And here we have about 6,600 adolescents. Now, the key independent variable is family structure, and here we distinguish between 4 different types that we focus on. First, both biological parents, which make up the majority, about 60% of families. Then 8% of children live only with their biological mother and do so since birth. Then 16% live with their biological mother only by age 14, but lived originally with both parents at birth. And 13% live with their biological mother and the father at age 14, but lived in a different family form at birth. And here in addition, we also differentiate the time that the child has spent living with the biological father by looking at the age of separation to distinguish between the categories 2 to 4. And we also look at the frequency of contact with the non-resident father at age 14. And that here we can only distinguish between those that still live with the father and have daily contact at the moment, then those who see the father more than twice a week, and those who see the father once or twice a week, and those who see the father once a month or less often. For mothers and fathers' gender ideologies, we measure them at child age 9 months. in a factor of 3 standard items that all focus on maternal employment, and they're pretty standard items used in the European Value Survey and International Social Survey Program, such as a child suffers when the mother works. And here the Cronbach alpha is slightly higher and is 0.6 for both mothers and fathers' gender ideologies. So we combine these items, but even if we treat them use them separately, that our results don't change. Then for mothers' employment and occupation, we face the limitation that we don't have annual employment histories for mothers, what we then do is we use a combination of maternal employment status at age 14 and their occupational status at age 14 as kind of as a proxy for their labor market attachment, probably also in earlier years, so that we distinguish between those who are still not in work when their children are 14 years old, those who are in work in a semi-routine and routine occupation, those in an intermediate occupation, and those in a managerial and professional occupation. And that way we really have a good percentage of women in all these occupational statuses, and at the same time across all family forms. So even among single mother families from birth, we have significant numbers across all these occupations. And for the fixed effects models, we also test a variable on maternal weekly work hours and the change over time. The other covariates that we use are, of course, cohort members' gender and age, ethnicity in different categories, the number of siblings, maternal education, and whether the father has higher or lower education than the mother. And for the fixed effects models, we in addition test some variables on changes in the log of the equivalized weekly household income, and whether the child experienced the home move between age 11 and 14. So let's go to the results. Looking at our first hypothesis, just generally testing the assumption that adolescents living with 2 biological parents really hold more traditional gender ideologies than those living with a single or a repartnered mother. And here you can see on the x-axis the different family forms, with the reference category being both parents. And here the bars show you the OLS regression coefficients. And interesting here is mainly this gray striped bar for girls in single mother since birth families, and they at first, when we only include control variables, then they still hold more traditional attitudes than girls in biological two-parent families. However, once we then also include maternal employment, this statistical significance actually vanishes, and we then don't find any statistically significant differences anymore. And across all the other family forms for boys and girls, we don't actually find any statistically significant differences for this for the item on women's employment, and same for the item on the division of family work, housework. There were no significant differences from the start. So on the whole, we are rejecting hypothesis 1 for the UK context, that here really we don't find that children in single parent families hold more egalitarian gender beliefs. If anything, this one group holds slightly more traditional gender beliefs, but that is partly explained by the weaker labor market engagement of the single mothers from birth. Looking at our second hypothesis, the influence of mothers' gender ideologies and mothers' employment, where we assumed that they would be more positively associated with children's gender ideologies in biological two-parent families than in single mother families or repartnered mother families. And here, first we start with the regression, again, OLS regression with family forms, and then we add a mother's gender ideologies. And here you can see throughout that there is no statistically significant association. And then we also add mother's employment status. And here we do find the the generally expected relationship that children of mothers who are not employed tend to hold more traditional gender ideologies. This is the case for all the groups except for this division of housework item for girls, where also this is not statistically significant. For girls and the women's employment item, we also find that actually mothers with higher occupational status seem to have slightly more egalitarian children, whereas this relationship doesn't hold across the board for the other item and for boys. Now, to test whether really the transmission is different across family forms, we then include interaction effects of maternal gender ideologies with family form and find no statistically significant interaction effects. So here we need to reject hypothesis 2 for this part. Then we test the same for maternal employment, whether that is influencing gender ideologies of children differently across family forms, using interaction effects. And here we do find some tentative evidence that for girls' attitudes towards maternal employment, we do find quite significant differences, in the sense that mothers who are in work, the red dots, tend to have more egalitarian children than mothers who are not in work, the blue diamonds, in families with both biological parents, whereas here, especially most clearly among the single mothers by age 14, and among the repartnered mothers, we don't find this statistically significant relationship anymore. And taken together, then yes, in other family forms, there seemed to be a somewhat weaker influence of maternal employment on girls' attitudes. Interestingly, then, when we do the same thing for boys, we find quite the opposite effect. So that actually in families with both biological parents, we don't find statistically significant associations with maternal employment, whereas we do find it for boys living in single mother families. And also once you combine these all the categories on single mothers since birth, single mothers by age 14, and mother and partner families, you also find that there is that effect seems to be greater in these families for boys. So here we really find that our hypothesis is partly supported for girls, but not for boys. And then for hypothesis 3, the influence of biological fathers is very easy to summarize very quickly, because we don't find that fathers' gender ideologies are significantly associated across most models, across most family forms, no matter who we look at, except the only exception is boys living with 2 biological parents. There we do find a weak significant association with fathers' gender ideologies. But again, the difference is not strong enough to the other family forms that we would speak of any significant difference in the transmission. And also, once we interact with time of co-residence, so age of separation from the father, or the most recent contact frequency, we don't find statistically significant transmission processes. So we need to reject hypothesis 3. When we now look at our longitudinal analysis and this mechanism of role restructuring, here hypothesis 4 assumed that really parental breakdown per se is associated with a change towards greater egalitarianism among children, whereas hypothesis 5 would then split that up more in detail and look at the contact arrangements with the non-resident father after the parental breakup. And we assumed that only greater, more intensive father care would be related to change towards more egalitarian ideologies for children. And here we use, as I said before, a fixed effects panel models, and we look at the change in gender ideologies between age 11 and 14. And what we are basically measuring with our independent variable of parental separation is the change in family form from 2-parent families to single mother families, because all the other family forms were too diverse and not large enough to be able to analyze them more in detail. And we observe about 5% of adolescents who experience this parental separation event during that age 11 and 14. And we show a first model where we just include parental separation and age, and then a second model where this parental separation event is split up into more detailed contact frequencies with the father after separation. Then we also run a third model, including some possible mediating variables that might explain some of the things going on, like maternal and work hour changes, income changes, and home move. But here, actually, we don't find any significant differences compared to model 2. So I will only show you model 1 and 2. And here we look at the first item, focusing on gender ideologies towards women's employment. And here we see the general age trend, children on average becoming more egalitarian between 8 and 14, but we don't find any statistically significant association with having experienced the parental separation in these 3 years, neither for girls nor for boys. In model 2, here when we look at boys first, you can actually see that boys who see their father more than twice a week actually do experience a significant change towards more egalitarian ideologies, and compared to children who see their father every day and still live with the father. And the other groups who see their father only once or twice a week or once a month or less, here we don't find any significant differences. They are located somewhere in between boys who in stable families and boys who see their father very often. And for girls, interestingly, we don't find that effect, but on the other hand, we do find that girls who see their father only once a month or less, they tend to become more traditional over that time span between 11 and 14. And both of these effects, in terms of effects of strength or of the association, are actually relatively strong in the sense that the size of the correlation is about two-thirds of the standard deviation in that gender ideology measure. And on the division of housework, we don't find any significant associations with these changes in either parental separation or in the contact frequency with the father after separation. So summarizing these results, we conclude that parental breakup per se does not generally result in more egalitarian gender ideologies. So we rejected hypothesis 4. And we do find partial support for hypothesis 5, possibly with boys who have very involved non-resident fathers, so who really seem to, when the parents really seem to share parenting quite equally, possibly, you know, with the children living 1 week with the father, 1 week with the mother, that they experience greater increases in egalitarianism. However, what's important to keep in mind, of course, is that we are looking here at small samples of boys that actually live in such relatively egalitarian parenting arrangements after separation. And for girls with very little contact to their fathers, we actually find that they change their attitudes towards more traditional ideologies and less support for women's employment after separation. And here one interpretation may be that these families, we find that they also tend to be more likely to move away or experience a home move, and that possibly that is related to more extreme conflict between parents, and that might actually lead to girls rejecting women's employment and rejecting the non-traditional family models and idealizing a more traditional family more. That was at least something that another group of scholars who I presented to suggested that this might be going on, that it really also depends on the level of conflict that children experience in their families, and very extreme conflict might actually lead to rejection of these more egalitarian non-traditional models. Yeah, so these are the findings from our fixed effects models, and overall, we basically then conclude that in the UK context, at least, we find very little variation in gender ideologies of adolescents across family structure. And that little variation that we find is different from the US and partly explained by lower maternal labor market attachment. And the transmission of gender ideologies of mothers and fathers does not vary across family forms in our analysis. Here it's important to keep in mind that we are only able to measure parents' ideologies during early childhood, so a decade earlier. And that might be one of the reasons why we find weaker relationships with these gender ideologies, because actually the reasoning and talking with children happens probably only during late primary school and late early teens, when children really start to reflect more on gender issues. Then in terms of role modeling through maternal employment, we find it's seems to be less influential among girls who experience parental breakup, but more influential among boys. So here our limitation so far has been a bit that we don't have very detailed maternal employment histories, and we don't have any information on the current gender ideologies of the stepfather. For trying to collect a bit more causal evidence, we analyzed the longitudinal change in the gender ideologies of children after relationship breakdown, and here we generally find that it's not breakdown per se that is related to changes in gender ideology of adolescents. If anything, it has to do with the parenting and contact arrangements with the parents, and probably also, you know, a more complex set of combinations of work and care. But we do find some weak evidence that this sort of role restructuring argument might be valid for this specific group that we can look at, these adolescents between age 11 and 14. And in combination, like when we go back to our motivation, greater plurality in family forms per se is not going to contribute much to gender egalitarianism. So that in general, I think we can conclude that. But it really will depend much more on the welfare state context, in particular its indirect effects through that family forms and breakups have through influences on maternal employment, shared custody and parenting arrangements. And therefore, I think more research is needed on different types of welfare states. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Pia and Ludovika. So I'm sure we've got now about sort of 15 minutes initially for questions, and we've got lots of hands up already. So I'm going to, I think Berkay got his hand up first, so I'm going to just straight hand over to Berkay so I don't take up your time.
Sorry, I was applauding, but I do have questions. So
sorry. Okay, sorry. So applauding. Yeah, so I'm not very good on the symbols. I assume these were hands up. Do you also have a question, Berkay, as well as a clap?
I do have a question as well. So,
I'll give you the question.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you so much for the great presentation. I have a minor pedantic point, which is not a question, and that minor pedantic point is basically you do have a list of hypotheses that you reject the not like hypothesis, which actually what you do is fail to reject the null hypothesis in the sense, which we don't have any clue whether these results are like these hypotheses are actually rejected. We just fail to find any evidence for these hypotheses. I think that is a very different interpretation of your findings than what you would say.
Yes, I agree.
So that's a minor pedantic point that I wanted to clarify. And then the second thing is, I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the family structure and the transmission in general, but I wanted to see the big picture here, which is in this cohort, holding these traditional ideologies in general, how exotic is it? Like, is it really common for 14, 15 years old to hold traditional gender ideologies in the grand scheme of the, and generally in Europe around this age group? Do you think that this UK cohort is particularly like common, typical, or are they really very modern in their like attitudes towards parental, like women's work? So I like, can you give a little bit more, maybe you did and I missed this, but can you give a little bit more contextual information that how should we take into account this one single cohort in the gender ideologies scheme? So, well,
I think actually there is not that much work on using representative data on adolescents' gender ideologies across countries, but we have done some analysis in using the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study in 4 European countries. So that would include Germany, England, not Britain, England, the Netherlands and Sweden. And here, when we look at the gender ideologies of adolescents in around that same age, we find actually that adolescents in Sweden are the most egalitarian, as you can imagine. So here we find really on common attitude items, they always reach ceiling effects very, very quickly. And then actually this is followed by the adolescents in England, and then the Dutch and the German adolescents are slightly more traditional in their attitudes. There are clear cross-national differences. They are also statistically significant, but still among all these 4 countries, the majority of adolescents tends to embrace relatively egalitarian attitudes on these sorts of statements that are actually often phrased quite traditionally. You know, many of these questions have been developed 2 decades, 3 decades ago. So they actually, in my opinion, they don't capture gender ideologies really to the full extent very well. You have a certain bias upwards because you simply don't observe enough variation at the top.
Good. Thank you so much. That answers the question very well.
Thank you. Who would like to come in now? Because if you don't, I will. Anybody? So while people are thinking of their questions, I had a question about this issue of not finding the difference that you might expect that you would get more or you get different attitudes, but also different transmission in lone parent families. And I was thinking about the fact that, and I'm sure my colleagues with young children can say more about this than me, but perhaps some of the issues that you're positing for lone parent families are also there for couple parent families. So, you know, the difficulties with the childcare creating conflicts between work and care. And so there isn't that strong, for example, and also the fact that a lot of partnered mothers with children work part-time in the UK. So you're not necessarily getting those sort of clear differences between couples and lone parents. If you want to comment on that.
Well, I think so we do, when we look descriptively just at the difference in maternal employment status, we do see quite significant differences across the family structures in terms of really mothers being in 2-parent families being much more likely to be in employment and also be more likely to work longer hours. And then, of course, we also have some differences across the different single-parent families that we have classified here, so that single mothers from birth have the lowest labor market attachment and tend to work shorter hours than the other groups. And repartnered mothers, I think they tend to be closer again to the 2-parent biological families. So I think the differences are, I think, given the UK context, I think they are like we would expect. So I don't think, or I would not have expected this to be a problem, because here we actually do find quite significant patterns as we would expect them.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So Chris has a question. Chris Maggio.
Hi, how's it going? I'm Chris. I'm an incoming fellow at LSE, zooming in from New York. Sorry if I overlooked this in the presentation, but you were showing the distribution of the gender ideologies, and they were quite skewed towards agree. and I'm just wondering, and sorry if I missed this, but could possibly the results change, or part of the explanation might just be, that there's just so few in those other categories, and maybe if you just compared agree and strongly agree, that could do something to show, okay, well, these are fairly progressive gender ideologies regardless, but like what's really inculcating like a strong belief in that might be something to do with family formation and so forth.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, we have done some tests with logistic regression models, simply dividing them into binary categories, and they're on the whole, given that again we don't have more variation to go on the whole, our non-significant results stay non-significant. But I think it's a valid point, and I think we need to test this a bit more. To what extent, depending on where we divide the categories, whether that really could still change some of our results. I think on the whole, given that they're not significant, we actually that it remains that way. But yeah, I think it's an important point that methodologically, of course, we face limitations there with just these four categories, and then also a quite skewed distribution.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the point that you made about, as these questions become sort of uncontroversial to adolescents, then, they almost need to start being asked in a way that's a little more radical or something, to see where's the limit of where these adolescents are at with their gender ideologies, right? So
yeah, thank you.
Do we have anyone else who'd like to come in?
Lucinda, I have a question. That's okay, Rana.
Yes, I couldn't see anybody, so please come in.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And I think I was just wondering if you looked at or found any differences by demographic characteristics. So, for example, location, because you said that there are representative samples, for example, from different countries. So whether there was any variation, or in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds of the families or ethnicity.
I will ask Ludovica to answer that question, please.
Hi. We didn't test across the UK countries, to be honest, even though we do take into account the survey design there. You do find a socioeconomic gradient, whether you measure it with income or with a composite. You do find that. You could find it also along housing, which we then didn't include. So, and in terms of ethnicity, you do find patterns that are as expected towards maternal employment. We do have to group quite largely, but Black Caribbean are much less traditional than all other groups, and then you would have white, and then other groups, other ethnicities, more traditional. So again, finding that corresponds to what has been found so far in terms of attitudes towards maternal employment. Yeah, so no surprises there.
Thank you. That's interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. We have Gudrun wants to ask a question now.
Thank you, PM. And what my question is not like an argument, but just like a question. I just want to ask to confirm that can we see for the hypothesis form, can we see it as a DID and also as a DID style, just like for the divorce, for the family breakup, it seems like can we see it as a treatment? Mm-hmm.
I'm really sorry. I'm not really sure I understood. Could you?
Yeah, I mean, for the for a family who have come to break up, can we see it as also as outside treatment rather than instead of just merely a panel data? Just like a difference in difference. Yeah.
A methodological question. Would you see that say they're treated if they break up? Is that what you're?
Mm-hmm.
Are you basically saying there might be a selected group of people who are breaking up, who we can see separating over time? Yes, they definitely are. I mean, they're. But basically, what the fixed effects model is supposed to do is at least capture any fixed time invariant unobserved characteristics these people might have before and after, and basically control for those. But you're right. I mean, we can only see the effect of those separating who actually do, which is not. We don't necessarily know how a separation of someone would have had an effect who is not actually separating. You know what I mean? The rest of the intact couples, we don't know.
Yeah,
so, yes.
I mean, what you have done in the hypothesis 4, can we also see it as a form of difference in difference?
A difference in difference.
Yeah.
Well, how would we have a control group?
I mean, some people, some families are got divorced, but some families are not. In the sample, you should control for there should be both of those two different cohorts. So it seems like for the divorce itself, it seems like a treatment. Can we see it as that way?
Well, but we only have one cohort. That so we cannot see any other people and their change over time except for that one cohort.
Okay, I see. So why don't you think about including those people who are not got divorced, so that we can seems like to got a DID. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. We do include everyone. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you.
Thanks. And we can probably come back to some of the methodological issues, but I think they're probably we're just about out of time. I know that Maria has got to end soon, but we can carry on with me taking over the host if some people have got some additional questions or want to carry on chatting to Pierre for a little bit. I think Buckeye had some more questions, so I'm going to turn back to him at this point.
Wow.
But we will be sort of closing down the formal part very shortly.
So, Lucinda, will you be stopping recording from this point onwards, or like?
So Maria said she will be stopping recording very shortly. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes, but she hasn't. From what it looks like, we haven't stopped recording yet. So carry on. So
just a follow-up thing to what Gudong has suggesting as a difference in differences. Actually, if you treat any divorce as an exogenous event that is happening to these children in the longitudinal data at different time points, and then you have stacked them all up and then treat every divorce event as a treatment, and you could start generalizing over 5 waves like to something like differences, although it's hard to prove all these parallel trends assumptions and other things. What we would be doing an approximation of a moving fixed effects of these lags, a distributed lag fixed effect structure, which is an approximation of a different diff. I think that's the only place where what Gudong says and then what you say could be coming together as like something similar to a different diff. Like I wouldn't call it a different diff because it will be quite difficult to prove some of these parallel trans assumptions on a growing cohort. But anyway, that will be something very similar to if you distributed fixed effects over time periods and then normalize the time, like time of the event as a time 0, and then look at before and after changes for each children. So that's one way of thinking about it. But my question was not related to that. But if you wanna,
okay, I think I'm starting to understand what you mean. May I ask? So, but that would require us to have more than 2 waves. where we measure children's gender ideologies. Is that right? And unfortunately, we only have 2.
Yeah, so like that wouldn't be, so for the outcome, yes, but yeah, that's right. No, you wouldn't be. So like also for the fixed effects, I had this initial question that you had this cross-sectional part where you have gone in gory detail about the family types, looking at 2 biological parents versus 1 biological, since the birth they are with the biological parents, and then with the step parent. And all these family complexity has been built up in the cross-sectional part, where in the longitudinal part that you only have a separation. I was wondering whether you could do more with that, right? So like in the longitudinal part, rather than just the separation, but look at types of family transitions and the complexity.
Well, I think at the beginning we were hoping to do that. It actually turns out that our sample sizes in terms of the subsamples that experience different types of transitions between age 11 and 14 for the children, they tend to be really quite small. So that's why we decided to then focus on this one type of transition where we have sufficient sample sizes. But perhaps Ludovico can say more about that.
No, not much. I can just reiterate that point. I think that in a way, I agree with the point that there is a little bit of disconnect between the 2 parts, but I think it's also nice to be able to dig a bit more into variations in family structure in the cross-sectional part, because there we have the numbers, and actually I think that's an important contribution, just to say, actually, it's not just the family form at that point in time where children are asked about their gender ideologies, but also trying to capture what has been going on before. And there we actually tried with very different definitions, and and the results are pretty much the same irrespective of that. But it's nice to have the 4 categories, I think. And it's just a matter of data that we don't manage.
I do agree that it's nice to have those 4 categories, but like I don't see why did you have to restrict those transitions to take place at between age 11 and 14. Why can't just you look at those people who have experienced those transitions at earlier ages, and then see what they do at how their gender ideology changed at much later stages, right? So if you use the full survey, many of these children will have some step parent join in the family at age 5, at age 3, at age 7. And then you would want to look at whether their views are different at age 14 than the others. And that might be one way of bringing together the 2 parts of the analysis, what cross-section versus longitudinal, because it's somewhere in between, right? You don't have to have the outcome measure to be varying over waves, even if you have just single wave outcome measure. On the right-hand side, the experiences could be and using the full survey. I was wondering whether you could just and that would give you a nice bridging between the 2 parts of the paper that I have.
Okay, so a larger portfolio of treatment in a way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of families in the Millennium Cohort Study experience a family structure changes in the form of single mothers marrying to someone else. Lone mothers marrying to someone else, and then bringing in a stepfather in the family is a big change. And then you are talking about the father effect, for example. It will be nice to see what % of those people at age 14 exhibit different attitudes than the ones that are stable with the biological father.
Well, I think we tried to do that already a little bit with distinguishing between the age of separation for those mothers who separated at some point between birth and age 14 of the child. And here we actually didn't find such clear patterns. So I think we were also a little bit discouraged by that. Yeah. In terms of the repartnered families, you're right, and there is quite a lot of variation going on, and also ins and outs. So these don't just repartner once; many of them repartner then several times. And I think then we at some point also said, okay, maybe we need to write a separate paper about classifications of step families, because that by itself is involves so much complexity, and there hasn't actually been that much published about it. But in this paper, we were kind of thinking, oh, it's too much complexity that is really hard to classify without having done a lot of other research already on step families. But I think we will definitely consider and discuss that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that response and for all the questions.